She didn't just ruin a wedding, she signed her own death warrant, and she did it with a smile on her face, a goblet of red wine in her hand, and 500 witnesses watching in absolute suffocating silence. Remember that image, because by the end of this story, that same wine-stained moment will be the thing that destroyed everything she ever had. Every wedding has its chaos, a missing ring, a drunk uncle, a bridesmaid who cries too loud. Those things get laughed about for years, but what Victoria Kensington did on her wedding day wasn't a mistake. It wasn't the alcohol, it wasn't the heat. It was the rotten, entitled core of a woman who had spent 28 years being told the world owed her everything, and she had just handed that world to the most dangerous man in Chicago. Victoria was not born cruel. She was engineered that way. Raised in the marble-floored mansions of Senator Aurelian Kensington, one of the most publicly polished and privately rotten men in American politics, she had learned from the cradle that money was armor, status was a weapon, and anyone beneath her financial tier was simply furniture. She wore her size like a crown, not a burden. A heavily built woman who had turned her physical presence into a battering ram, she had perfected the art of making every room she entered feel smaller simply by occupying it louder. Custom Chanel, custom Gucci, custom everything. The world bent to Victoria Kensington, or it suffered the consequences. What she did not understand, what her father, in his arrogance, had failed to warn her about, was that the man she was marrying did not bend for anyone. Lorenzo Moretti was 34 years old, cold as January marble, and the undisputed head of Chicago's most powerful crime syndicate. He did not believe in love. He did not believe in sentiment. He believed in leverage, strategy, and the slow, merciless execution of a perfectly laid plan. Marriage to Lorenzo was simply another contract, blood-inked, binding, and entirely transactional. The math was simple. Senator Aurelian Kensington had a problem, a catastrophic 8-figure problem. He had been gambling with the Russian bratva for years, losing spectacularly, and the debt had ballooned into a number that would collapse his political career, his reputation, and likely his life the moment it became public. Lorenzo had a different problem. The federal government was closing in on his shipping ports. He needed political immunity. He needed access to zoning boards, police commissioners, and the gleaming, respectable surface of legitimate high society. He needed a senator in his pocket. The solution was elegant, if monstrous. Lorenzo would eliminate Aurelian's Russian problem, fund his re-election through dark money, and in exchange, Aurelian would deliver his daughter as the seal on the deal, a human signature on an unholy contract. Victoria was told none of this, of course. She was simply informed she would be marrying a powerful, wealthy man, and she accepted because Lorenzo Moretti was rich enough, dangerous enough, and frankly impressive enough to satisfy even her catastrophically inflated ego. She arrived at the Moretti estate 3 months before the wedding, as though she were doing them a favor. She was an hour late to the private family dinner Isabella had lovingly prepared, sweeping in wearing a violently bright pink dress that strained at every seam, her face painted in theatrical makeup, her presence sucking every ounce of oxygen from the room. Isabella Moretti had set the table herself. Handmade pasta, slow-roasted meats, fresh bread still warm from the oven. It was not just food. It was an offering, a gesture of welcome, of grace, of old-world dignity that women like Isabella carried in their bones. Victoria looked at it, curled her lip, and loudly announced she was on a juice cleanse, calling the spread greasy peasant food. The room went rigid. Dante Lombardi, Lorenzo's right hand and a man who had done things in dark rooms that would make hardened criminals flinch, reached instinctively for the weapon beneath his jacket. But Isabella simply raised one manicured finger, a single, elegant gesture that said more than 1,000 words. She smiled, not a warm smile, not a forgiving smile, the kind of smile a chess grandmaster gives the moment their opponent makes the move that will cost them everything 3 turns from now. You have much to learn about respect, she murmured. "And you have a lot to learn about who you're talking to," Victoria snarled, leaning her considerable weight over the antique dining table and sending a crystal water goblet crashing to the floor. Isabella excused herself quietly. She didn't argue. She didn't retaliate. She simply left the room, and in doing so, made herself the most dangerous person in it. For the next 3 months, Victoria dismantled everything she touched. She demanded a $5 million wedding budget. She hijacked the security protocols Lorenzo's men had built around the Drake Hotel. She fired Isabella's florist because the woman had an accent she found irritating. She treated the syndicate's soldiers, men whose loyalty had been forged through blood and silence, like personal errand boys, screaming at them to fetch iced lattes and haul shopping bags while she waddled between boutiques. Through every single transgression, Isabella watched. She did not intervene. She did not complain to Lorenzo. She observed, catalogued, and waited. Victoria mistook that silence for weakness. She thought she had broken the great Isabella Moretti. She thought the matriarch had retreated because she was afraid. She was so profoundly, catastrophically wrong. The wedding day arrived soaked in July heat and dripping with forced opulence. The cathedral ceremony was held under a lockdown so tight that a 3-block radius had been swept clean of any human being who hadn't been vetted by Lorenzo's men. Victoria descended the aisle in a mountain of white silk and diamonds, her custom plus-size couture gown trailing behind her, so heavy it required 4 bridesmaids to manage the train. She looked like a queen. She felt like a queen. She had absolutely no idea she was walking into a cage. The reception at the Drake Hotel was extraordinary in the way only truly dangerous gatherings can be. 500 guests, governors beside capos, carefully avoiding eye contact with men whose rap sheets were longer than the cocktail menu. Lorenzo worked the room like the professional he was, shaking hands, sealing deals in whispered sentences, moving through the crowd with the controlled efficiency of a man who was always working, always calculating, and never, ever present for anyone who wasn't useful to him. This enraged Victoria. She was the bride. She was the center of the universe. And her own husband was ignoring her. So she drank. Glass after glass of vintage Dom Perignon. And then she switched to Cabernet, which was a mistake. The alcohol stripped away what little filter she possessed, and left behind only the raw, seething entitlement that had always lived underneath. The moment that would define the rest of her life came when the orchestra faded to silence, and a microphone was set up in the center of the dance floor. In the Moretti family, the traditional blessing was sacred. The mother of the groom would present the bride with a piece of ancestral jewelry, a symbol of protection, acceptance, and inclusion into the bloodline. It was not a gesture. It was a rite. Isabella emerged from the crowd in a midnight blue gown, understated, perfect, devastating in its elegance, holding a velvet box containing a diamond and sapphire brooch that had been carried out of Sicily in the 1920s and had survived more history than anyone in that room. She spoke into the microphone with the calm authority of a woman who had never needed to raise her voice to be feared. She opened the box. She stepped forward to pin the brooch to the sash of Victoria's gown, and Victoria Kensington sneered, "Don't touch me with your bloody mob trinkets." The words hit the microphone, hit the speakers, hit every single person in that ballroom like a physical blow. 500 people stopped breathing simultaneously. Dante froze mid-step. Senator Kensington's face turned the color of chalk. Isabella's hands stilled in the air. "Victoria," she whispered, a warning vibrating just below the surface of her voice. "Take the pin!" "I said no!" Victoria shrieked, her voice climbing into a hysterical register that bounced off the high ceilings of the Drake's grand ballroom. "I don't want your cheap stolen jewelry. I don't want your greasy family. I am a Kensington. You are all just a collection of uneducated, violent animals, and I am doing your son a favor by letting him buy my family's name." Silence. The kind of silence that precedes catastrophe. Isabella's face did not contort. It simply hardened, the way steel does under extreme heat, becoming something else entirely, something colder, something final. "You are drunk," she said softly. "Go to your room." That dismissal, that quiet, devastating dismissal, was the thing that cracked Victoria open. Her ego could not survive it, not in front of 500 people. On her wedding day, not from this woman. With a sound somewhere between a scream and a roar, Victoria raised the crystal goblet she had been gripping and hurled the contents directly into Isabella Moretti's face. The dark red Cabernet exploded across Isabella's features, soaked into her silver hair, streamed down her midnight blue gown like something out of a horror film. The crystal glass slipped, hit the marble floor, and shattered into 1,000 pieces. 3 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. To strike the matriarch of a crime family in front of the 5 families was not an insult. It was a declaration of war. Isabella reached into her clutch, removed a silk handkerchief, and with a precision that was somehow more terrifying than any outburst, gently dabbed the wine from her eyes. She looked at Victoria the way a butcher looks at a side of beef, not with anger, with assessment. Lorenzo materialized from the edge of the room. He crossed the dance floor slowly, his footsteps ringing out over the broken glass, and he stopped beside his mother. He took the handkerchief from her hand and wiped a stray drop of wine from her cheek. He kissed her forehead. Then he turned to his bride. Victoria stood panting, her chest heaving against the brutally tight corset, a smug, triumphant smirk spreading across her flushed face. She had publicly dominated the room. She had put the old woman in her place. She had won. She had absolutely no idea that she had just triggered the machine that would destroy her. She had it coming, Lorenzo. Victoria breathed. She needs to know her place. Lorenzo looked at her. No rage, no drama, just those flat, dark, shark-like eyes taking her apart piece by piece. He leaned close to her ear. "My mother's place," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is on a throne. Your place is in the dirt. But we are going to finish this reception, Victoria. You will smile. You will cut the cake. We leave this hotel, the Kensington name dies, and your nightmare begins." The remainder of the reception was a masterclass in Mafia discipline. Victoria danced with her new husband, his hands cold and heavy and utterly devoid of warmth, and she smiled for the cameras because she still believed, even now, that she had won something, that she had established herself as the untouchable new power in the Moretti Empire. She was magnificent in her delusion. At 1 in the morning, they departed the Drake Hotel in an armored Maybach, and Victoria sprawled across the back seat, kicking off her diamond-encrusted heels, fully expecting to be heading toward O'Hare International and a 6-week honeymoon in the Maldives. The car turned north. The Chicago skyline faded behind them. "Where are we going?" she demanded, irritation sharpening her voice. Lorenzo said nothing. He sat perfectly still in the darkness, watching the highway swallow them. "I am talking to you." She reached across the seat to grab his shoulder, and he caught her wrist in mid-air with a grip that felt nothing like anger and everything like a machine. A crushing, mechanical pressure that stopped all the blood in her hand. "You speak when spoken to," he said, his voice entirely flat. "You are no longer a Kensington. You are property. And tonight you damaged family property. That debt will be collected." 2 hours later, the Maybach stopped in front of the Ironwood estate, a compound buried deep in northern Illinois woodland, surrounded by electrified fencing, razor wire, and men with automatic rifles and Dobermans. It looked nothing like a home. It looked exactly like what it was. Victoria screamed. She threatened. She demanded to call her father. Lorenzo pulled a glowing tablet from his jacket and held it in front of her face. The screen was running CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC simultaneously. The breaking news ticker across all 3 channels read the same thing. Senator Aurelian Kensington indicted on 42 federal counts of wire fraud, racketeering, and illegal gambling. FBI secures Kensington estate in late-night raid. The blood left Victoria's face all at once like water draining from a basin. You promised him, she whispered. You promised him immunity. I promised to eliminate his Russian bratva problem, Lorenzo said pleasantly. And I did. I never promised I wouldn't hand his unencrypted accounting ledgers directly to the Department of Justice. Your father is in a federal holding cell. His assets are frozen. The Kensington name is finished. You have no money, no allies, no leverage, and nowhere to run. She was dragged sobbing through the heavy oak doors and down the stone stairs into the industrial kitchen of the estate, a cold, bleach-scented room with long steel prep tables and no warmth anywhere. Standing at the far end, dressed in a simple black morning dress with a silver rosary in her hands, was Isabella Moretti, still immaculate, still terrifying. The ruined midnight blue gown was already gone. Isabella had not been waiting in grief or fury. She had been waiting with purpose. When you came into my home, Isabella said softly, I offered you bread and you spat on my floor. When I offered you my family's history, you threw wine in my face. You believed your size and your father's money made you untouchable. But in this house, there is only one God. She touched the crucifix of her rosary. And only one master. Beatrice, the estate's head housekeeper, a woman whose loyalty to Isabella was absolute and whose expression had never once registered anything resembling mercy, stepped from the shadows. Strip her of that dress, Isabella said. Burn it. Burn the jewelry, the extensions, and the shoes. Give her the grey uniform. The rules were simple. She was forbidden from leaving the lower levels. She was not permitted to speak unless spoken to. She would earn her keep. The next 6 months were the most brutal dismantling of a human ego that has perhaps ever been executed in private. Victoria, who had never lifted anything heavier than a champagne flute, was assigned the deep maintenance of the estate. She scrubbed stone floors on her hands and knees. She hauled 50-pound bags of flour from delivery trucks. She laundered the heavy tactical gear worn by the compound's guards. Her body, which she had weaponized for years, became her greatest obstacle. Her joints screamed. She collapsed against walls, gasping, weeping, demanding doctors. Beatrice would hand her a mop and point at the floor. Tears do not clean the grout, ragazza. The greasy peasant food she had mocked became her only fuel. At the end of 14-hour shifts, she received a bowl of minestrone soup and a slice of bread. No midnight snacks. No chefs to abuse, no one to perform for. The hunger was real, the exhaustion was real, and slowly, terrifyingly, the armor began to fall away. The fat that had encased her began to recede under the relentless caloric deficit of hard labor and simple food, though her frame remained broad and heavy. Her nails broke, her skin roughened. The expensive, entitled glow that had once made her feel invincible was replaced by calluses and silence. She stopped screaming. Then she stopped arguing. Then she stopped talking altogether, except when required. Lorenzo never visited the lower levels. He had installed his own puppet politicians in Chicago using the vacuum left by Aurelian's imprisonment, and he was thriving. He was technically married. He lived entirely as a bachelor. Exactly 1 year after the wedding, Isabella descended the stone stairs. Victoria was at the iron sink in a coarse grey uniform, her hair knotted back, scrubbing a cast-iron skillet with the focused, wordless efficiency of someone who had stopped fighting reality and simply accepted it. She heard footsteps and did not stop working. She had learned that pausing meant extra chores. Victoria. Isabella's voice was quiet. Victoria turned slowly, keeping her eyes on the floor. She wiped her soapy hands on her apron and gave a stiff, clumsy curtsy that had been earned through 365 days of hard lessons. Signora Moretti, she whispered. Her voice was barely there. Isabella approached her and reached into her blazer pocket. She withdrew a small velvet box. Inside, on black satin, was the diamond and sapphire brooch. "Today is your anniversary," Isabella said. A year ago, you proved you were unworthy of the title of Moretti wife. Beatrice tells me you have become an adequate dishwasher. Victoria stared at the floor. A tear fell from her cheek and landed silently on the scuffed leather of her work shoe. I am sorry, she whispered, and for the first time in her life, she meant it with every broken piece of herself. I am so sorry, Signora. Isabella reached out and tilted Victoria's chin up with cool, unhurried fingers. She looked into those eyes. The defiance was gone. Entirely, completely, finally gone. The monster of entitlement had been starved and worked and silenced into extinction. I know you are, Isabella said. She took the brooch and pinned it to the collar of Victoria's grey cleaning uniform. Wear this. It will remind you every single day of the life you could have had, if only you had known how to respect your betters. She turned and walked up the stairs. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. Victoria stood alone in the cold, silent kitchen. She looked down at the priceless diamonds glittering against her damp, soapy apron. A symbol of royalty pinned to the uniform of a servant. She turned back to the iron sink. She picked up her sponge. She went back to work.